Life in a medieval castle wasn't all feasts and fancy outfits. Sometimes it was just about surviving in the dark. Before electricity came along and ruined all the fun, kings and their courts had to get creative. From the priciest lighting methods to the humblest glows, they figured out how to keep their stone walls from feeling like a cave. And when it came to lighting up those massive spaces, they had quite a few tricks up their royal sleeves. Let's start with a very simple yet effective method: candles. These weren't your typical birthday cake decorations. We're talking serious illumination here. The rock stars of the medieval lighting world were beeswax candles, while regular folks had to settle for tallow candles, basically made from animal fat, which smelled like a barbecue gone wrong. The fancy pants of society insisted on beeswax, and who could blame them? Beeswax candles burned clean and bright without making everyone smell like they'd been hanging out in the kitchen all day. A single high-quality beeswax candle could keep going for up to 9 hours, perfect for those long winter nights when Netflix wasn't an option. Speaking of money, these candles weren't cheap. Each beeswax candle could cost between 6 to 10 pennies. That might not sound like much, but back then it was enough to make a peasant's eyes water. To put it in perspective, imagine spending $50 on a single candle today. That's the kind of luxury we're talking about. And get this, a medium-sized castle would burn through 300 to 500 candles every month. Talk about lighting up your wallet. But the real showstoppers were the chandeliers. Picture massive wooden or iron contraptions hanging from the ceiling, dripping with candles like some medieval version of a disco ball. During big feasts, they'd light hundreds of these bad boys, turning the Great Hall into what must have felt like Times Square to medieval eyes. The poor servants had to scramble around lighting each candle before sunset. No easy task when you're balancing on a ladder in a drafty castle wearing those pointy medieval shoes. Here's where it gets interesting. Candles weren't just about seeing where you were going. They were basically the medieval equivalent of a Rolex watch. The more candles you could afford to burn, especially those fancy beeswax ones, the more loaded you were. Kings would deliberately light up their feast halls like a Christmas tree to flex on their visitors. Oh, these hundreds of beeswax candles? Just a casual Tuesday night in my castle? No big deal. The evening entertainment revolved around these flickering lights. Instead of binge-watching their favorite shows, nobles would gather around the candlelight for storytelling sessions or to discuss the latest castle gossip. Important state matters were often handled by candlelight, which probably explains some of the questionable decisions in medieval history. Try reading a peace treaty by flickering candlelight and see if you don't accidentally agree to marry off your firstborn to a neighboring kingdom. Managing all these candles was a full-time job. The castle had to maintain massive stockpiles of candles, especially during winter when the sun decided to make only brief appearances. It was like running a medieval Yankee candle store, except instead of having 50 different scents of winter wonderland, you just had to make sure you had enough light to avoid walking into walls. If candles were the fancy lighting option, oil lamps were the reliable workhorses of medieval castle illumination. These trusty lights were perfect for smaller spaces, kind of like the table lamps we use today. Except instead of plugging them into the wall, you had to deal with various types of oil that would make a modern health inspector have a heart attack. Let's talk about what they burned in these lamps, because it's quite the menu. In Mediterranean regions, olive oil was the premium choice. It burned clean and bright, making it the Tesla of medieval lighting. But move up north and you'd find people burning animal fat that produced light with all the grace of a smoky campfire. Some clever folks used seed oils from flax or nuts, while coastal areas went full fisherman style with cod liver oil. I can only imagine the unique ambiance that was created. Nothing says "welcome to my castle" quite like the smell of burning fish oil. The real game changer was how long these lamps could burn. While candles tapped out after 9 hours, oil lamps could keep going for 12 to 15 hours straight. That's longer than a modern workday, which is pretty crucial when you're trying to run a kingdom without electricity. Kings particularly loved having these in their bedrooms because nothing ruins royal beauty sleep quite like your light source dying in the middle of the night. The basic design was surprisingly simple. You'd have a container made of metal, clay, or ceramic, basically whatever wouldn't catch fire. Medieval people learned that lesson the hard way, I'm sure. Then you'd drop in a wick made from braided fibers like flax, hemp, or cotton. The medieval equivalent of "some assembly required," Except instead of following IKEA instructions, you were trying not to set your beard on fire. Here's a fun fact that might surprise you. Oil lamps were actually a sign of decent planning and wealth management. Unlike candles, which you had to stockpile like a doomsday prepper, oil could be stored for longer periods without going bad. Plus, you could buy it in bulk and refill lamps as needed. It was the medieval version of having a Costco membership, smart shopping for the savvy castle manager. The placement of these lamps was an art form in itself. You'd find them tucked into wall niches, perched on tables, or hanging from specially designed holders. The smart castle designers would create little alcoves just for oil lamps, complete with reflective surfaces behind them to maximize the light. Medieval interior decorators knew their stuff, but perhaps the most brilliant thing about oil lamps was their portability. Unlike those massive chandeliers that required a team of servants and possibly a small crane to manage, one person could easily carry an oil lamp around. This made them perfect for those midnight trips to the castle kitchen for a snack, though I imagine more than one royal midnight snacker discovered that carrying an oil lamp while trying to smuggle a meat pie back to your chamber was a skill that required practice. The real challenge came when it was time to refill these lamps, though. One wrong move and you'd have oil everywhere. And let me tell you, getting olive oil out of a medieval tapestry was probably not fun. Speaking of fire hazards, it's probably time we talk about the most dramatic lighting option in medieval castles. Torches. These were the rock stars of medieval lighting. While candles and oil lamps played it safe, torches were all about drama and showing off. They were basically giant flaming sticks that could turn any boring castle corridor into an instant action movie scene. These bad boys weren't just random sticks set on fire, though I'm sure some people tried that approach once. They were carefully crafted using soft woods like pine or fir, usually about 3 feet long. Perfect for lighting your way and accidentally singeing your eyebrows if you weren't careful. The clever part was soaking them in tree sap or resin, which made them burn longer and hotter. It's like medieval lighter fluid, except it actually worked in the rain and wind. The amount of wood these castles went through for torches was insane. We're talking about 1,000 to 2,400 pounds per month. That's roughly the weight of a small car in wood just to keep the castle lit. The local lumberjacks must have had arms like tree trunks themselves. You had different types of torches for different occasions. The standard handheld ones were like the medieval equivalent of a flashlight, perfect for those midnight trips to the kitchen or checking if that scary noise was a dragon or just the wind. Wall-mounted torches were the permanent fixtures, basically medieval streetlights for castle corridors. Then you had the fancy braziers and torch stands for courtyards and great halls, because nothing says, "I'm important," quite like a massive column of controlled fire. The best part about torches, they could burn for quite a while. Your basic torch would last 1 to 2 hours, but if you got fancy with the resin soaking, you could stretch that to 3 to 4 hours. That's enough time to host a feast, plan a crusade, or figure out why the court jester keeps disappearing into the wine cellar. Of course, all this dramatic lighting needed something more permanent and cozy to complement it. That's where the real heart of castle lighting came in. The mighty fireplace, which did a lot more than just keep people's toes warm. These weren't just holes in the wall with flames, they were the social media hubs of their time. Every important room had one, from the Great Hall to the king's private chambers, and even the kitchen, though that one was more about cooking than looking cool. But keeping these stone frame party spots running was no joke. A decent-sized castle would burn through 2 to 4 cartloads of wood every single day. That's 60 to 120 cartloads per month. Just imagine being the poor soul in charge of the castle's firewood supply. "Sorry, my lord, we can't invade France this month. We spent all our money on firewood." The fireplace wasn't just about warmth. It was a status symbol that screamed, "I'm fancy enough to have a giant hole in my wall that constantly needs feeding with expensive wood." Kings and nobles would show off their elaborate fireplace designs like modern homeowners show off their massive flat-screen TVs. The bigger and fancier your fireplace, the more important you obviously were. The light from these fireplaces wasn't super bright, but it created this cozy, flickering glow that was perfect for gatherings. People would huddle around them in the evening, sharing stories, plotting political schemes, or just trying to avoid freezing their royal bottoms off. It was like a medieval coffee shop, minus the coffee, and plus a lot more sword-related conversation. But even with all these lighting sources, candles, oil lamps, torches, and fireplaces, medieval folks still had to deal with a lot of darkness. This led to some pretty interesting sleeping habits that would make modern sleep experts raise their eyebrows. You might say they had a different relationship with bedtime altogether, but it has a name, and it's called biphasic sleep. Well, medieval folks didn't call it that. They just called it normal. Instead of our modern 8-hour snooze fest, they split their sleep into 2 chunks, like a nighttime double feature. And honestly, given how dark their world was, this made a lot of sense. Here's how it worked. Shortly after sunset, everyone would hit the hay for their first sleep, which lasted about 3 to 4 hours. Then, in the middle of the night, they'd wake up for a couple of hours of what we might call medieval me time. Kings would use this wakeful period for all sorts of activities, reading important documents, probably squinting by candlelight, having secret meetings with advisors, because nothing says confidential like a 2 a.m. chat, or checking on castle security. Surprise inspections were probably hilarious for the half-asleep guards. After their midnight adventures, they'd head back to bed for another 3 to 4 hours of second sleep. It's like they had a built-in intermission in their night. This wasn't just some royal quirk either. Everyone from peasants to kings followed this pattern. It was as natural to them as binge-watching shows is to us today. The really interesting part is how this affected castle life. During that middle-of-the-night wake period, you might find all sorts of people quietly going about their business. Guards changing shifts, servants preparing for the next day, or maybe even the king himself wandering around with a candle, pretending to do important king stuff while actually just looking for a midnight snack. This sleep pattern wasn't just some random habit. It was perfectly matched to their lighting situation. With limited artificial light, people naturally followed the sun's schedule. Winter nights were especially long, sometimes lasting 14 hours or more. That's a lot of darkness to fill with just candles and fireplaces. Breaking up sleep into 2 parts made those long nights more manageable and less boring. But even with their clever sleep schedules, medieval folks still needed to make the most of natural light when they could get it. Speaking of which, let's talk about how castles were designed to catch every precious ray of sunshine. The sun. Getting sunlight into a medieval castle was like playing a giant game of architectural Tetris. Those narrow windows weren't just for archers to shoot arrows through. They were carefully designed to maximize natural light while keeping the castle defendable. Talk about multitasking in architecture. The great halls usually got the VIP treatment with larger arched windows facing east or south. This way, the king could hold court sessions during the brightest parts of the day without having to waste precious candles. It's probably also why most medieval paintings show people looking so serious. Try maintaining a royal expression while squinting in a beam of sunlight. Castle courtyards were the medieval equivalent of a solar panel farm. Built in the center of the castle, these open spaces became the hub of daytime activity. Everyone from servants doing laundry to nobles practicing their sword fighting would crowd into these sunny spots. You can bet there was some serious competition for the sunniest benches during lunch breaks. The really smart castle builders would position their fortresses on elevated ground, not just for defense, but also to catch those sweet rays of sunshine. It was like medieval real estate developers knew the value of a good view. The position of every major room was carefully planned around the sun's path, kind of like modern solar-powered homes, except instead of charging batteries, they were charging their vitamin D levels. But what happened when the sun went down? Well, that's when our old friend the moon took over the night shift. Moonlight played a surprisingly important role in medieval castle life, even if it wasn't exactly reliable. Guards particularly loved a full moon. It meant they could actually see potential threats without having to wave torches around like medieval lighthouse keepers. It's hard to be stealthy when you're basically holding up a giant "Here I am" sign. Some clever kings would schedule outdoor diplomatic meetings during full moons. Nothing says I'm powerful and mysterious quite like negotiating treaties by moonlight. Though I bet more than a few important documents got signed with random squiggles because nobody could actually see what they were writing. The real problem with moonlight was its unpredictability. Cloudy nights could turn the castle into a game of guess what you just walked into, and even on clear nights, you couldn't exactly read the latest medieval bestseller by moonlight. Kings who tried to host fancy moonlit banquets probably spent half their time assuring guests they'd just stuck their elbow in the gravy and not something worse. But when the moon wasn't enough, which was most of the time, medieval folks had one more lighting trick up their sleeves, a cheap and cheerful solution that even the humblest servant could afford. Enter the humble rushlight, the dollar store candle of medieval times. These simple lights were made from dried rush plants dipped in animal fat, making them the medieval equivalent of a DIY craft project. They were so cheap and easy to make that even the poorest castle servant could afford to light their way to bed without bumping into walls. Each rushlight only burned for about 15 to 30 minutes, which isn't exactly marathon performance, but hey, when your other option is stubbing your toe in the dark, even a brief flicker of light starts looking pretty good. Kings and nobles would sometimes use them as backup lighting in their chambers, probably while muttering about how they'd really need to order more of those fancy beeswax candles soon. The process of making rush lights was simple, but kind of genius. You'd take these long rush plants, basically tall grass, peel off the outer layer, except for one thin strip to support the pith, the soft inner part, then dip it in leftover animal fat. It was like the medieval version of recycling. Nothing went to waste. Though I imagine the castle didn't smell great during rushlight making day. The best part about rushlights was how they democratized lighting. While the king upstairs might be reading important documents by expensive beeswax candlelight, the servants downstairs could still enjoy their own little flickering lights. They were perfect for that last bit of mending before bed, or maybe writing a letter to your sweetheart if you were one of the lucky few who could write. Of course, all these different lighting methods together, from the fanciest beeswax candles to the humblest rushlights, created a castle that was alive with flickering lights, each telling its own story about medieval life.